Good afternoon, good morning. My name is Sandra O'Connell. I'm Director of Architecture and Communications at the Royal Institute of the Architects of Ireland, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to the fourth and last topic of the 2021 Global Architecture Exchange Series, the impacts of COVID-19 on the way we practice architecture. The pandemic has changed how we practice architecture, and I think it will only emerge in the coming months and years just how transformative these changes have been. It has certainly accelerated the use of technology, and we will hear today from architects how they have adapted to new ways of working through technology. Technology is also an opportunity to address social inequalities and encourage more diversity in the workplace, and it has brought us all closer together, as this talk series demonstrates. We will also hear how architecture itself has been used as a tool to support communities in the pandemic, improving health, housing, and lives. The Global Architecture Exchanges were developed in 2020 and are a partnership between the American Institute of Architects, the Australian Institute of Architects, the Architectural Society of China, the Royal Institute of Dutch Architects, the Council of Architecture and Urbanism in Brazil, the Japan Institute of Architects, the Korean Institute of Architects, the New Zealand Institute of Architects, and the Royal Institute of the Architects of Ireland, and the Royal Institute of British Architects. I'm delighted to be the host of this collaboration with our sister institutes, where we have the pleasure to have a great lineup of international speakers from 4 different countries in Europe and South America. It's fantastic that once again we have an audience from many different countries from across the world, and it's great to be able to reach out to so many of you wherever you are. Today we have an excellent lineup of speakers from Europe and South America. They will talk about their experiences and the challenges they face in their part of the world when thinking about the impact of the pandemic. May I take the opportunity to thank our speakers, whom I will introduce shortly individually: Anne Henry, Fiona Hughes, and David Healy from Grafton Architects in Ireland, Neil McOmish from the UK, Juliano Jimenez Ponte from Brazil, and Aldo Vos from the Netherlands. So thank you all so much for taking time out of your busy schedules for this event. It is sincerely appreciated. Before we move to the sharing session, there are a couple of housekeeping points for our audience. There will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end. If you wish to ask your questions, please type these into the questions box. We will then get to as many questions as possible. However, if yours have not been answered, a record will be kept and you will be contacted with an answer where possible. For any queries, please do not hesitate to contact Emmanuel and the team at the RIBA, RIBA@riba.org. I'm now delighted to open the sharing session. Each of our speakers has around 6 minutes to share their thoughts. And our first speakers are Anne Henry, Fiona Hughes, and David Healy from Grafton Architects in Ireland. Grafton Architects were founded by Yvonne Farrell and Shelley McNamara in 1978, having graduated from University College Dublin. The practice's numerous awards include the inaugural RIBA International Prize for the UTEC building in Lima, Peru, the RIAI Gold Medal for Bocconi University in Milan, the RIBA Royal Gold Medal in 2020, the L'Équerre d'Argent Prize for Best Building in France for Toulouse School of Economics, and most recently, Kingston University London's Townhouse, which won the RIBA's 2021 Sterling Prize. David Healy is Associate Director at Grafton Architects, having been with the practice since 2011, and also in the years 2005 and 6. Previous experience includes working with Hina and Peng Architects and working as a studio tutor and lecturer at UCD School of Architecture. David is a graduate of UCD School of Architecture, as well as having studied at Aarhus School in Denmark. Fiona Hughes is Associate Director at Grafton Architects and is Assistant Professor in the School of Architecture, Planning and Environmental Policy at UCD. After graduating from UCD in 2004, Fiona has worked in private practice with Altracht, Simon Walker Architects, GZA, Odos and Grafton Architects, and has worked on many international and national award-winning projects and competitions. At UCD, Fiona has contributed to and led studio and lecture courses, including innovative teaching approaches and emphasizing linkages to practice. And Henry has been part of the team in Grafton Architects since 2014, working on the Institute Means Telecom in Paris-Saclay, the redevelopment of the ESB head offices in Fitzwilliam Street in Dublin, and most recently, the Marshall Building for London School of Economics. Previous experience includes working with Donaghy Diamond Architects and Scott Talon Walker. A graduate of UCD School of Architecture, Anne has worked in London and Paris, and then in New York following graduation with Tsao and McKeown Architects. In 2014, she completed a diploma in building information modeling at TU Dublin, and she is a passive house designer. Anne, I would be delighted for you to start the presentation now.
Thank you. So thank you, Sandra, for the introduction, and thank you for inviting us to speak today. When we were asked to talk on the subject of practice during the pandemic, we thought to share with you our experience of working on a project in London, the Marshall Building, that was on site during that time. In March 2020, when the pandemic struck, we left our offices like everybody else, and we packed our stuff into our computers and our whatever equipment we needed into the back of taxis, and we naively wondered how we managed just for a couple of weeks at home. Many of us are still actually at home. And while we cobbled together the workspaces and the homeschooling arrangements and all that everybody had to do, in fact, the work on the project really never stopped. The site never really stopped. It just closed for a very short amount of time. And so we had to hit the ground running and just get a new way of working. And technology was obviously the tool that helped us to do that. So just to give you some background on the project, in 2016, Grafton Architects won a competition to design a university building for London School of Economics and Political Science, so LSE. And the building is a major new development for the university, establishing a new presence for the university onto Lincoln's Inn Fields in London as part of their campus. And the principal design members are AKT2 structural engineers and CBDSP as MEP consultants with construction by design build contractor MACE. And next slide, please. So at approximately 18,000 square meters, the building houses lecture theatres, teaching spaces, informal study spaces and offices for academics, PhD students and the Marshall Institute on the top floor. There's a large sports hall in the basement and squash courts and associated sports facilities, music and rehearsal and arts facilities. And next slide, please. So the idea is to make a structure that would creatively deal with all these differing uses and the need to transfer from smaller scale spans at the upper levels to the ever increasing spans at the ground floor level and the lower ground floor level. So this led to a weave of tree-like columns and beams which direct the forces of gravity to the ground through ever-increasing outward spread of the diagonal branches. And under these tree branches, a large open space, a great hall, at the ground floor provides a new social space for the university. Next slide, please. So this is a photograph of the site at the time that we left the office, so March 2020, or just a little bit before March 2020, and you can see that the structural frame was well underway, and the sort of cross-like structures that you can see, those are the tree branches for the second floor. So that's the stage we were at when the pandemic struck. So as you can imagine, it was an extremely busy time for the team. Lots of contractor meetings, lots of drawing reviews, production of set out information, and a lot of contractor coordination meetings. And our team were all based in Dublin. We've been used to travelling frequently to visit the site. So all that changed very, very suddenly for us. Next slide, please. And here you can see our programme sort of plotted against daily cases of COVID in Ireland. So when the pandemic hit in March 2020 and the lockdown came into force, this was our busy period. And so, as I said, the site shut actually very, very briefly, just for 2 weeks. And even during those 2 weeks, our design work continued. So nothing really stopped. And we had to kind of seamlessly try to migrate then to remote working. There were no more visits to London, and in fact, we couldn't actually travel more than 2 kilometres from our desks. So we were pretty tied to the project. And I suppose the question there then is, so how did we maintain or even improve the quality of our service in this period? I'm going to hand you over to Fiona.
Thank you. So site inspections became our first challenge. After a short period when COVID initially struck, we were able to resume our site visits with the help of trusted local architects, Adam Pivoy and Anne Bassett. And this is a photograph of Adam standing outside the site, wearing all the equipment required for a virtually relayed site visit during a global pandemic. So you have the normal safety equipment, a selfie stick, a video conference on his phone, a Wi-Fi booster, a camera, and of course a mask. So it's not easy wearing that much equipment for long periods. Thank you. So for this period where site visits were conducted in person by Anne and Adam and then virtually by the team in Dublin, we trialed different methods to see what would work. And eventually the site visit consisted of 3 parts. Firstly, the person on site would walk the site and take the time to take the building in. Then followed a live video conference with the team in Dublin who had all the drawings and specifications at their fingertips. Finally, for the areas where there was no Wi-Fi or mobile data, as it happens, we would take videos for further analysis. And interestingly, the advantages of the process has informed some of our more recent site inspections and possibly something we'll always carry through. These images are of the north elevation onto Lincoln's Inn Field, and you will see the large, in the bottom left-hand corner, the large 3-storey panels being erected on site by Techrete. So Techrete produced these panels in their factory in Dublin and were based in Dublin. So before COVID hit, we were able to inspect some of these panels in the factory, and it was a real joy when we were able to return to site in person to be able to see the panels in their final destination, reflecting the midday and evening sun in London.
So then back in the office, while the site was ongoing, we continued to produce design information for site, set of drawings, details and sketches, as Anne mentioned earlier on. We migrated our Revit models, which was our way of working, to a cloud platform to facilitate access from multiple locations. But otherwise, our processes remained unchanged. We continued to make drawings from models across the wider team, including specialist subcontractor designers and our own design team, AKT and CBDSP. The only major change being that our rate of printing dropped to 0. As the office went remote, our in-office communication was replaced by messaging platforms. Temporarily, WhatsApp followed my migration to a formal platform, Slack. To mimic the office environment, we ensured that all communications were held in open channels, which are visible to all team members. And this had the advantage that everyone in the team was aware of topics ongoing, which supported learning and allowed for awareness of interrelated issues across topics. This also fostered a sense of team endeavour when we were all quite separated from each other physically. As contractor meetings went remote, a surprising point is that we found there to be more ups than downs. First and foremost, the right people could attend the meeting rather than maybe a selection of 1 or 2 from the office. Attendees weren't tired from travel, and we found that people focused on the material presented on screen. There was also the big advantage that we started to hone our on-screen sketching skills, which also promotes more paperless work. Next slide, please. Handing over to Anne.
Thank you very much. So another challenge we faced was how to monitor the quality of materials for the project without being able to visit quarries, stone yards, etc. We were fortunate, I suppose, in that some of the key decisions had been made. The mixed designs for the concrete and the choice of stone had generally been agreed before the pandemic. So post the pandemic hitting, we were fortunate that we had our facade consultants had representatives in the UK who were able to visit, and we would carry out quarry visits by video link. I think we would all agree that you can't really replace the physical on-site expertise for these visits, because you really can't judge the tone or consistency or the quality of material. So it was really just very beneficial that we were able to have a representative that could visit for us, and then we could attend by video. And then during this period, during which no travel was permitted, it coincided with a very intensive period of sample reviews, approvals and benchmarking. And we were fortunate again to have a representative on site during this contractor and client reviews. So while the team in Dublin attended by video link, we had somebody in person. And when feasible, we had duplicate samples sent to Dublin, which was really beneficial. Now that was sometimes that, you know, there wasn't time for that, but certainly it was something that we would have felt was beneficial. And you know, so you can obviously see the material yourself. So again, color selection and texture and the ability to view or judge samples physically within the site context is probably, maybe I think we would have thought, one of the more challenging aspects of this kind of remote working. I'll hand over to Fiona.
So when it was safe to do so, we were absolutely delighted to visit site again in person. It was fantastic to be able to stand in the space of the Great Hall, connecting Lincoln's Innfield to Portugal and Portsmouth Street behind, and to see the concrete trees reaching up through the floors to bring light in. Ultimately, there's no substitute to being able to stand in the physical space of architecture. What had been interesting about the site visits in recent months is that our experiences during 2020 have informed the process today. We could see the advantages of a dialogue between the site and office settings, and it means that the personnel most attuned to a certain part or detail of a project can join in for a site visit or for parts of the site visit, and their knowledge and expertise can inform the inspection, resulting in a much more collaborative approach across the office. We are now nearing the end of our site inspections, and for these final inspections we're using BIM 360 Field. This is software that was introduced to us by the contractor Mace. It's an online software where all photos, descriptions and location pins are held in one virtual space. It has been a joy to see the project unfold up close and personal over the last number of months.
So this picture is from one of the first times I returned to site in August of this year, and ultimately ultimately the building came together much better than any of us could have imagined, and a number of factors worked in our favour in this regard, but especially the exceptional team of contractors led by Mace and the visionary client team at LSE. This is an aerial view of the project from a webcam that was maintained throughout the construction progress. So like I was saying about the factors that worked in our favour, was all the managers, designers and craftsmen within all the companies under the contractor and within LSE were fully committed to delivering a project of exceptional quality, even in the face of the challenges of the pandemic. And across the whole team, people were completely on board with learning the new tools that were needed to work in this context. And it was this spirit of cooperation that kept the wheels turning and delivered such a great result. So it's very comforting for us at this point to step back and look at an old drawing of the project from early planning stages where it's sitting amongst its neighbours, and to reflect on how this project has come into being in such unusual circumstances. That's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David, Fiona and Anne, for sharing this fascinating story with us. I think it's incredible what you have achieved during such difficult times, and not just, you know, by embracing technology and using technology to its very best, but by bringing all these people with you and holding the team well together. So very, very impressive. Thank you so much. We're now moving across the water to our neighbours in Wales, to Cardiff, where Neil McOmish is our next speaker. So Neil is on the strategic board at Scott Brownrigg and leads the Practice's Cardiff office. Having graduated from the Welsh School of Architecture at Cardiff University, Neil continued his research education at the Bartlett School of Architecture, University College London, in space syntax theory. He's currently completing his doctorate in the city and memory. And that sounds absolutely fascinating, Neil, and I hope it's something we will be reading in the future. Neil works across all sectors, delivering design excellence grounded in social commercial judgment. He believes that creative and innovative solutions are generated by working closely with clients and working collectively on their aspirations, and that a critical analysis of place and the specific context will result in the most appropriate and best architectural design. Neil has been appointed to the UN WTO Scientific Committee for Sustainable Tourism, advising on this year's global conference on sports tourism in Barcelona. He's the only appointed architect. Neil, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, good morning, everybody. Delighted to present some of our thinking today and how the pandemic has affected the way in which we practice architecture. Next slide, please. Scott Brownrigg, by most measurements, is one of the oldest architectural practices in the UK, having been founded in 1910. I think what that's given us is the ability to be agile, to remain relevant and to be adaptable. And I think that that's something that we've learned collectively as a profession over the last 2 years. And certainly Grafton have demonstrated that in their previous presentation. Next one, please. You can probably see there all the dark grey countries are the countries that we're operating in at the moment, and we have projects in. We have studios in Singapore, Amsterdam, London, Edinburgh, Cardiff and New York. And perhaps that enabled us to have an infrastructure in place that facilitated collaborative working and a remote studio working on Revit models and BIM models in the cloud to our advantage when lockdown happened, and we had to retract from that first point of principle of just jumping on a plane and going to see a client somewhere in the world. Next one, please. We have a thing called the Design Research Unit, which is our depository of knowledge, but also our engine for change. And we took that unit and focused it on how architecture and the environment might respond to the pandemic, not just in terms of material science, but in terms of space, place, organisation of spaces, and urban environments. Next one, please. We had a web-based app that we had previously used to gather data on workplace profiling. We could manage to change that app to actually start gathering data from clients and gathering brief material in the absence of having those intimate conversations and intimate sessions with our client base. So this was a fantastic piece of technology that enabled us to still establish key relationships with our clients. Next. This involved us being involved in a project in New Zealand, probably couldn't get further away. I was fortunate enough to go there 3 times in a single year, which was pretty exhausting. This was one in competition for an iwi group, the people, the Ngāti Whakaui, a tribal group around the outside of Lake Rotorua. And it's an episodic master plan that has a series of responses to site and place. But actually understanding the narrative and understanding the oral history of the Maori people probably couldn't have been gathered remotely. And that was something that we had to do in those intimate situations. Next, please. However, the design process took us through COVID, so we had to respond in all sorts of ways. Our client is one of the largest engineered timber contractors in the Southern Hemisphere, and we developed this idea about a dispersed hotel with Professor Terry Stevens from Swansea University, looking at how we could manufacture off-site the majority of the components for the scheme, and even looking at the idea borrowed from Aldo Rossi, the idea of a floating theatre, so we could still take theatre to the community rather than the community have to come to a theatre in unsafe conditions. Next, please. And this involved that understanding of place, of context. So this was a Maori Arts facility, a contemporary film festival, and likewise geothermal. It sits on a massive geothermal site, so we could create spa facilities that actually use the geothermal water as a series of fractured objects within the landscape. Next, please. This led directly on to another master plan in a place called the Barony in Ayrshire. This is an ex-coal mine, and it was about the rewilding of this site. And this was a site that we couldn't go to see. So we had to learn some of those lessons from understanding the client, the brief, and the articulation of the site through the gathering of data remotely as much as we could. Next, please. But still, some of our preoccupations were about how people would occupy this unique environment. And actually, it taught me something about myself as well, the way in which I draw, and can relate that to my colleagues and other consultants. So I started to develop a technique through Photoshop of specifically layering drawings in a way in which they could be then deconstructed and then turn into three-dimensional objects. Next, please. The Rhondda Tunnel is a unique place, and it's only 30 miles away from our studio here in Cardiff, but it might as well have been 3,000 miles away, because we couldn't get to that either. In fact, I tried to go to site and a policeman informed me that architecture wasn't essential, and it wasn't an essential trip, which I took some exception to. But we developed this idea with a group called the Lumen. They promote digital art. It's kind of like the Pritzker Prize for art. And it was the reappropriation of a 2-mile-long tunnel into the world's longest digital art gallery. And we shared the ideas through shared platforms with the community, and actually had to deliver the scheme on site through my own iPad as a remote experience to the local community, which of itself was fascinating. Next one, please. And so it was about the generation of a series of spaces and the enrichment of these spaces that came through that process of understanding it, even to the point where some of the light and ventilation ducts we turned into a digital musical instrument, so that you can hear music inside the tunnel, but it can also play music over the fantastic landscape of the Rhondda. Next, please. And finally, the idea of this enigmatic art hotel that actually plugs itself into the landscape, becomes part of that landscape as a series of dragon bones, if you like, that cling on to the side of the tunnel. And then finally, again, a project that we had to start remotely. This was an old ironworks in the Western Sahara, and this takes up the narrative of the Berbers in this part of Sahara, their art, their heritage, their culture and language as an extended master plan that reaches out into an absolutely unique part of the Saharan desert. Utilising saltwater greenhouses. That's not a technology that extracts saltwater from the sea, but actually captures salt air through cardboard filters and turns them into food. So that whole idea about a circular economy, creating a new place in what appears to be the middle of the desert, but is actually just a short distance away from Dakhla in Morocco. And so the articulation of that, you know, the idea about the Islamic and Arabic mishrabiyah, solar shading, the sustainable collection of reused timber to create this kite centre. Dakhla happens to be the kite surfing centre in the world, and a whole series of propositions about how we could make this new place in a place that we had never visited. So again, we had to collect all of the data and the narrative from the local community remotely. Next one, please. And finally, some CGIs. And actually, I was fortunate enough to go to the site eventually last month. And most of the moves that we had made in those initial design propositions were entirely appropriate, but the master plan facilitated levels of change and modification through that process. Next one, please. And just like with Grafton, this is a big scheme that we're doing in Moscow, translating drawings, data, information onto site is probably one of the most difficult and problematic. And we use very similar techniques to our colleagues at Grafton Associates to ensure that quality information and the way in which our buildings are put together and the concept underpins the detail, and the detail underpins the concept is consistent. Next one, please. And even to our studio in New York, where the questions about climate, energy, our use of the natural materials on the site, they exist and haven't gone away through the pandemic. So this is actually a wheel that generates energy in the middle of Fifth Avenue. It acts as a transport hub, so you can go down through the medians to the tube in New York, but also acts as a visitor attraction within the centre of Manhattan. Next one, please. And having done all of that, now that the pandemic looks like at least it's the beginning of the end, if not the end of the end. Will we just jump back on airplanes again? Will we just go back to our old habits? I think the critical and existential threat of climate change presupposes that what we've learned through this pandemic should mean that we can practice architecture and practice it sustainably in an entirely different way. We've been forced into that through necessity, and I would suggest that we should take that as a inherent lesson. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Neil, and also for these thoughtful closing words of your presentation. I think they resonated with us and our attendees very, very deeply. And you and your practice have certainly been very busy in these last 18 months of pandemic. Thank you for showing us so many beautiful projects. We are now traveling to northern Brazil to meet Juliano Jimenez Ponte, an architect and urbanist based in Belém, a Brazilian northern city. Juliano obtained his PhD in urban and regional planning at the Institute of Urban and Regional Research and Planning at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. He is currently working as a consultant for the development of State of Pará Sanitation Plan. He provided consultancy for the region's housing plan between 2008 and 2010. Juliano is a researcher and practitioner in the fields of environmental, urban and regional planning and specializes in urban water management. An associate professor at the Federal University of Pará, he teaches and researches in the Faculty of Architecture and Urbanism in both undergraduate and postgraduate programs, and at the postgraduate program Risk and Natural Hazards Management. Juliano, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Emmanuel, and hello to all of the colleagues and friends here. It's such a pleasure to be here at the RIBA and with all the other institutes of architects in this event. And thanks to my National Council of Architecture and Urbanism, which is the analog of the institutes. I hope we may have a faster, productive and stimulating discussion on COVID-19 pandemic and the built environment. Yeah, this is a favela, a kind of slum in the south zone of Rio de Janeiro city, Brazil, southeastern Brazil. It is a touristic spot in the city of Rio, dense, populated, violent and precarious. The news are the financial cost of solving the housing problems in Rio would be equivalent to about 2% of the cost of the total COVID-19 local crisis. Obviously, improving housing conditions in the city would not prevent the coronavirus spread, obviously, but certainly would make things easier to live in. Next one, please. Brazil is unfortunately run by a far-right negationist which makes us the second country in the world in proportional cases and deaths in the pandemic. Not only vaccines came too late for us in the country, but also territorial and built conditions deficiencies made their way into a realm of panic, indignity, and authentic disgrace among us, I should say. Regional conditions in the country draw a geography of the disease varying from highly urbanized locations to countryside or forested spaces. The periphery of Brazil suffered more. City suburbs, poorest states, smaller settlements, all deficient in sanitation, in housing and built conditions, with low-income labor markets for the majority and high unemployment rates. Next one, please. The negationists in the palace forced the press to create a consortium to let people know what's actually happening in the country. That is, 611,000 deaths and 22 million cases confirmed in the pandemic. The old post-war discussion on territorial and economic center-periphery paradigm is still here then. The red states are increasing, the yellow states are stable, and the blue ones are decreasing in cases and number of deaths, decreasing, and according to the statistics. That is very scary for us, and it should not be that way because Brazil has a NHS-alike system of public health, which is totally free for the users and a large experience in vaccines, but that's the way it is. The next one, please. These are 15 from the most important metropolitan regions in Brazil. And there we can see São Paulo with more than 10% of national deaths by COVID-19 and its consequences, and a total number of 231,000 people killed by the virus and its effects. Especially density, the percentage of precarious housing and slums, lack of sanitation and high contiguity among dwellers and housing units are the main causes. This is a Metropolis Observatory work and in the data public from IBGE, which is the official statistics agency in Brazil. Brazil's regional question is shown in the map. The north region, the Amazon states, such as Amazonas, the first one, Amapá, which is a neighbor of ours here at Pará, are on the highest slum percentages, alongside with southeast and northeast states known by inequality and poor housing standards. I live in Pará, which is the fourth one, by the percentage of domiciles with slums or any type of precarious housing, which is very massive if we consider the state of Amazonas, where a false immunization strategy took place and run by the federal government, which is the most precarious in housing conditions among all the Brazilian states. Many people died there. The next one, please. Then, the lack of sanitation and the domiciles overcrowding are on the principal reasons for a nexus among architecture, planning, urbanism, and the COVID-19 pandemic. As in Brazil, only 62% of the domiciles are connected to water supply networks, there is a clear relation between slum percentage, low housing and infrastructure standards, and the epidemiological scenario. We have still this lack of infrastructure, and slum upgrading should be on the list for our housing priorities. The market doesn't think so. Next one, please. This is Paraisopolis. It's the polis of paradise. That ironic name. It's a slum in São Paulo, South America's largest city. southeast Brazil, with 100,000 people living in there, with a density of 1,000 inhabitants per hectare. The problem is the lack of infrastructure, not really the design itself, as the morphology is compact and is a very rational, popular, vernacular strategy of settlement. But as soon as it's precarious, it doesn't work, obviously. The exposed continuous and contiguous rhizomatic landscapes resembles a continual brick wall with gray roofs, loose pipes, and cables at the slums and many others in Brazil. Next one, please. This is Recife, Pernambuco state, northeastern Brazil, which shows social spatial segregation explicitly with the already traditional Brasília Teimosa slum. That's the name of the slum. 55,000 residents, 850 people per hectare, low income and lack of social services. It is quite close to the city core, to the city center. Next one, please. That's the place where I live, where I come from, and it's really impressive, I guess. It's a slum in these fruit plains of Belém, and it's the most precarious river basin with slums of the whole metropolitan region. It's called Estrada Nova, which means new road. It used to be a US collaboration project during the Second World War for the epidemic scenario of malaria, okay? So with slums over floodplains and extreme poverty settlements, Estrada Nova, south side of the city, are at the same time an attempt to translate the peasant techniques to build with wood and timber, and a typical peripheric and dramatic solution. Next one, please. The council has been CalBR, which is our institute in Brazil for the architects and urbanists, has been working on these teams for a couple of years with technical assistance for social housing funds and programs in several regions of Brazil, relating the actions to the pandemic and public health issues. Next one, please. Social movements and organizations released the Despejo Zero, which means zero evictions campaign, due to federal government intentions to make pandemic a bizarre opportunity to relocate or, directly speaking, evict the poor from public and private lands, and particularly from expansion real estate zones. Fortunately, this initiative has had success. The zero eviction campaign, and the National Congress passed legislation to stop evictions during the pandemic. Next one, please. But the labor market for architecture, urbanism, and planning in Brazil has become harder with the low investment economic policies in Brazil, a process that has been deepened by a work legislation alteration neoliberal cut. CalBR, our institute and council, has made its annual legislative seminar at the National Congress and has discussed the theme. Not just housing has become precarious, but also labor conditions in Brazil under market-oriented conservative policies. Next one, please. Then the Council has also discussed the protocols of reopening for studios, for office, for companies, and for construction sites. That is, the staff involved directly in low wages occupations in construction sites figure out among the most lethal, the majority of the killings with other low-wage occupations such as janitors and so on. So they were very exposed and they died much more than the offices occupations, for example. Then in construction sites, in trying to respect through this discussion accessibility, sanitary norms, despite the general critical situation. From the point of view of strict professional needs, there are good news though. The collaborative processes, the remote activities and discussions, and the ICT value, but business contracts in Brazil were postponed or even cancelled as well. For the so-called Global South, the matters of infrastructure provision, land regularization, and adequate housing became even more urgent. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Giuliano, for this powerful presentation. It was a stark reminder of how poverty and access to healthcare and housing is directly related to some of the worst effects of this pandemic. And I think if we were looking at climate change, we would find the same. So I agree with you in your concluding comments of the kinds of actions that are needed. We now move on to our final speaker from the Netherlands, Aldo Vos from Burg Bakkema Architects. You're very welcome, Aldo. Aldo graduated from Delft University of Technology in 1996, after which he started practicing. In 2005, he became architect director of Bakkema, and in this position he has worked with many projects over the past 16 years. Most famously, he designed Gebouw X, I hope I pronounce this correctly, for Windesheim University of Applied Sciences in Zwolle, which won the Building of the Year award from the BNA. And he also designed the Energy Academy Europe in Groningen, which won the Groningen Architecture Prize and the Briam Award in the category Mixed Use and Other. He has been a guest lecturer at the Rotterdam Academy of Architecture and Delft University of Technology, and is a board member of the association Volkskracht for Historic Monuments. Aldo, you can start your presentation.
Thank you very much. I think in the Netherlands we didn't have a lockdown like you had in the UK, so going to work was a lot easier for us. Can I have the next slide? And of course, the pandemic hasn't been as worse in Europe as in Brazil, which is quite shocking if you see the numbers again. Next slide, please. But it did change the way that we design, or the way that our clients look at their buildings. So that's, I want to show you one project in the end, how that worked. But first, I think I use this picture for this picture of this boy for many years now, because I think the way we design and the buildings we make, what we want to achieve for people is like a climate that this boy is sitting in, a forest with a nice temperature, fresh air, good acoustics, and of course he has Wi-Fi because he has to work. So in every building we try to design, we try to accomplish this climate. And our office is as old as the office of Neil, also started in 1910. But this is project number one of our office, the famous vanilla factory in Rotterdam. A wonder of space, daylight, fresh air, now World Heritage. And since 15 years, our office is also based in this former tobacco factory. So this is the place we're working now. Next. Our field of expertise doesn't always allow us to make a place like the picture I showed you of this boy in the nature, because we do a lot of projects for R&D, research and development companies, pharmaceutical companies, and there always the focus is on work processes and never on architecture, daylight. They don't need windows, they think. But that's always something we try to not to forget, that there are actually people working in these in these laboratories, for example. Next slide, please. The same counts for education. We try to create communities for all the kids, that they can meet, join, have a good space for that. Next, please. Our offices. This is the headquarters for Canon in the Netherlands. It's in the middle of the forest, and we also try to get the forest inside. Next slide, please. This is the Energy Academy in Europe. It was the first zero emission building, education building in the Netherlands. I think even in Europe. Here they do the research. It's a research center in the north of the Netherlands, where we have all the natural gas fields. Sorry, I see a question popping up. So it's a research center for the energy transition, because the gas fields are, we're running out of gas, and we now have earthquakes in the north of the Netherlands, so a different topic maybe. But to design this Energy Academy, we really wanted to design an architecture powered by nature, really low tech. Next, please. And from a programmatic point, it's a connecting building for the research people from the university, the student with their education, and businesses which also have their offices in this building. Next. But I think the most interesting thing in this building is that it's really low tech, and it's the whole climate of this building is designed with nature. So as much as possible, it's quite a deep building. As much as possible, normal daylight, of course. But it's almost every room in this building is naturally ventilated. And we use the earth, the soil in the Netherlands, for an underground piping system to bring and climatize the outside air into the building, into the atrium, into the offices. We also use the winter garden for this. Next slide, please. So the winter garden is actually part of the air quality system, and you see huge pipes on the left which introduce the air to the winter garden, and then it goes under the ground into the offices. Next slide, please. And then 2 years ago we had the lockdown. And we thought we were we all had to go to the office to do our work. And then the question came, why do we go to work anymore? Because as all of you also noticed, we can do everything from home. We have all the software, all the things to do our normal kind of work, make drawings, etc. But why do we really go to work, to our office anymore? And I think it is because we miss, or we have to meet other people for communication. Next slide, please. And then when the pandemic just started, we had a new client, a huge Dutch banking company with their headquarters in Amsterdam. Designed in the 90s by Cohn Peters and Fox, really corporate headquarters. But so there were 5,000 people working here, but they were all sitting home. And at the same time, they had another office in Amsterdam, which is on the right, which is an old 1980s building designed by our office, 6 stories high. And they were choosing which building will be our future headquarter, this shiny corporate building in the central district of Amsterdam, business district of Amsterdam, or this 6-story 1980s building, which is a bit run down. But nobody wanted to go into the elevator anymore. And if you have these high-rise buildings, you're completely depending on elevators. And you can have 1 people at a time in an elevator during the pandemic. So if you want to have 5,000 people at their workplace, that will take you the whole day. Next slide, please. So they decided to transform the old 1980s offices designed by our office into their new headquarters. And that's the design we're working on right at the moment. A very horizontal building, 6, sometimes 8 stories high. It's 300 meters long, and you can reach every floor just by stairs. Next slide, please. This is a section of the first floor and a bit of the surrounding landscape. And what we try to do is bring the natural landscape inside and make it a public space. It's 2 football fields wide, where not only employees of the building, but also the neighborhood can come in, have a coffee, have a look at the art collection of the bank, go to the restaurant, go to the congress spaces, to the film studios, etc. But a really horizontal public landscape as the heart of this building for 7,000 people. Next slide, please. So this is a section with all the, of course, there's a huge emphasis now on making healthy buildings. That's much more than BREEAM outstanding or Paris proof, because there's a huge focus on energy consumption. So of course this building is energy neutral, but it's mostly a very healthy building with lots of space, lots of air, and lots of places where you can meet each other. So it's really a place to connect people, because I think that's the future of offices, is that it's not an office, it's like a clubhouse. It's a meeting place for people. Because standard work, we can do from home as well. Next slide, please. So this is the entrance of the building, and in the background you can see the old building where we removed the facades, and it's going to be an atrium space. And all new program is constructed in wood, in timber. It's a timber construction, 50,000 square meters, new square meters, completely constructed in wood. And half of the atrium is not like a hard stone floor plan, but it's all trees and green. So I think what we learned from the pandemic is if you want to go to work, it's because we want to work together. So make it like a meeting space, make buildings future-proof. So I think it's also, if the pandemic doesn't end, it's the end of high-rise. Make a good, timeless, spacious structure. Make really healthy buildings that people can open their windows. There's lots of green and fresh air inside, and have a really welcoming building for because buildings are meeting places for people. Thank you very much.
That was absolutely fascinating, Aldo, how you told the story of how your client, selected their headquarters building, and also what is important to them in their new office, the much more horizontal space, the social space, the idea of the office as a clubhouse. So it sounds all quite futuristic, but it's already here. So thank you so much for taking us through that. I would like to start now our Q&A session, and would like to invite the audience again to share their questions in the Q&A box. We hope to get to as many questions as we can. We have about 25 minutes left for Q&A, which is really good, because everybody stuck so well to time. So thank you very much to our speakers. I've a question that I would like to address to all of you, and I'm going to start in reverse order. So sticking with Aldo, our last presenter, and then moving on. But looking back over the last 18 months, what has been the most transformative aspect of your work as architects? Was it a new skill, a new technology, a new way of working? Maybe you could just share that a little bit with me, and maybe starting with Aldo. What's been most transformative for you?
For me to work as an architect, or for my clients?
For you as an architect in your own work.
Oh, that that working together, that communication is key in work processes. Well, now I really know this, because in the first few months, so many things went wrong, miscommunication. So yeah, my employees are, I really need them near me. That's what I really learned. Yeah.
So the collaborative aspect of architecture is still the same, has endured, yeah?
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you very much, Aldo, for sharing that. And for you, Juliano, in Brazil, what has been transformative, or you have worked, changed dramatically in the last 18 months?
Thank you, Sandra. Yes, the relationships in the personal contact is a key. Then there were several problems with these kind of issue, but also there was an expansion in relations, as we could reunite the newer ways, and there was this geographical expansion as well. Several work groups were created during the pandemic, and new fronts for work and for research and for consultancy have been created as well. Then I guess there were problems, but there were innovative, creative solutions using the virtual environments. Then I guess that we are privileged, as we can think our work as an intellectual and data-based work. Then I guess for architects, there has been a kind of expansion for communication and the opportunities, but several problems as well, as I told about the contracts here in Brazil.
Thank you so much, Juliano. And Neil, what about for you and your projects? What has been most transformative?
I think understanding that a quantitative assessment is not necessarily a qualitative one. So we operated probably effectively and productively for the first few months. But what was missing was the intimacy of personal contact and the occasional conversation of serendipity, really, particularly with some of our younger graduates that have enthusiasm and learn by osmosis. And it doesn't matter how good technology is, it can't replicate that. It can't replicate that Jean-Paul Sartre. I only know of my existence because I see my reflection in your eyes. And I think that to understand that that kind of life is precious, really.
That's again very philosophical, Neil. Thank you so much. Beautiful reflection there. So from Grafton Architects, maybe Anne, would you like to answer that question?
Yeah, hi. Yeah, I suppose for us, similarly, there's the whole thing about remote working and remote meetings. But to a certain extent, what was transformative for us was that we didn't have to do all this traveling anymore. And that did, I mean, it had lots of benefits for us in many ways. And then we, like we talked about in our piece there, it's just in some ways we found that opened up, it opened up different kind of conversations, and it allowed in some ways team members, I suppose when you have a site that's not in your own country, it ends up being particular team members, possibly more senior team members who always travel, and the ability to have more and younger people involved in meetings, because there's no limit to how many people can attend a meeting. People don't mind if people listen in, so it does broaden that learning experience for younger members of the team. On the other hand, younger members of the team, as Neil said, they really lose out on the whole social contact in the office and that serendipity of, overhearing conversations, just passing by somebody's desk. All that stuff, I think, is, that's really, really important. It's more important, I think, probably for younger graduates, new to working in the office environment, who can feel very isolated and alone when they're at their desks at home. And I think maybe with people who are more used to working together, have had a working relationship for a long time, I think it wasn't really that difficult for us to migrate onto platforms and message each other incessantly. I mean, sometimes that's a bit transformative to me. Sometimes I find it a bit of an overload. I don't know if anybody else has, 3 or 4 different platforms going at the same time, plus your email, and then your phone can ring. And sometimes it does feel like it's just impossible to keep track of it all. I think some of my younger colleagues are better at it than I am. What else? I suppose the other thing that we sort of jokingly all said was the screen grab, and using, so basically our emails have turned into a series of screen grabs, and it's been, to me, it's transformative. It makes life so much easier. Communication, I think, is, so improved by these little bits of technology that really change how we talk to one another, particularly with contractors. We're not trying to use words to describe what we mean. We can quickly put in an image very quickly and quickly sketch over it and very quickly send that to somebody, and they can be on site with their iPhone, and this can be WhatsApp. There's definitely like a lot of, I don't know whether that's, I think the technology existed, it's just we became better at using it because we had to. And David was mentioning that, sometimes when, before COVID made us have to do these things, we would sometimes have suggested, going on when we couldn't attend site, or, there would be meetings called at very short notice. And, traveling was just like such a difficult thing. And sometimes it would only be for a short meeting. I'm sure everybody in this forum has experience of that. And we would say, well, can we just set up some sort of conference? And there was a much more negative attitude then. Now nobody even blinks at that sort of thing. So, it's interesting. And, that sort of chaos moves you forward. But the impetus wouldn't be there, I think, if we hadn't had to do it. So I suppose that's kind of some of the transformative things we would see.
That's hugely interesting, and I was wondering as well. I mean, you could be ambassadors for this now, for embracing technology, because we still need a lot more architects, I think, to come on board with this. And I was wondering, David spoke so well about, all the positives coming out of technology. David, how do you think that's going to continue to expand, in architecture practices, use of technology?
The technology, well, when I saw that question, I thought it was kind of more about to just the wider use of technology in the design and construction industry. I'm not totally familiar with how individual practices are with their own technology, but one thing that we definitely see in the UK is that the contractors, or the kind of design wing of contractors, are very sophisticated in their use of 3D modeling. And I think that's maybe something that should start to happen in Ireland, is whether that could be like supported by the government or something, but I think there needs to be more growth in that regard, because, you know, it starts to become really important for other kind of issues like sustainability. You know, the more you can predict and the more carefully you can design something, the more you can minimize waste on site and also make things safer on site. That said, I'm like, we did work with TechReach, who are obviously in the Irish construction industry, and they were incredibly sophisticated, and, you know, everything arrives on site and it all fits together. It's quite remarkable.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. We have a question here from our audience, and it might relate actually to Aldo's presentation. The question is, the concept of building horizontally instead of building vertically is quite interesting. However, how do we presume this would happen, especially in densely populated cities such as London or Mumbai, where land is scarce?
Yeah. Well, good question, but I think it's perfectly possible to have densely populated cities. London is not a high-rise city, right? I mean, you have a bit of high-rise, but it's a traditional European city, as is Paris or Munich, quite densely populated, but not high-rise. It's all like 6, maybe 8 stories high. So I really don't believe that high-rise is necessary for dense population, and I really don't believe it's the future. Sorry.
Yeah. And I was wondering if Neil has also some thoughts on this, because his PhD is focused on the city and memory. And I was thinking, just looking at your projects, Neil, landscape is so important in all your work, and your buildings beautifully connect with landscape and existing built structures such as the tunnel. How can we do this in cities? How can we bring more green landscapes into the cities?
I think there are a few precedents I can think of in that regard. Ken Yang, bless him, you know, and the bioclimatic tower that has virtually informed urban environment in Singapore, and vertical gardens, I think is transformative, isn't it? It's created microclimates, it's afforded green spaces to ventilate spaces, a little bit like some of Aldo's projects. I think the other thing that we have to be mindful of, though, is that we often use this generic phrase, people want, people like. I worry about that a little bit. What people? Who assumes that they have a consensus of values? You know, if I'm a hay fever sufferer, the last thing I want is a load of trees in an atrium space. I want to be away from that. So I think what we have to do is think about appropriateness and think about different environments that can afford different levels of human condition. My PhD about memory is all to do with the idea of collective memory and how we make spaces special, spaces and places, not just within buildings, but outside as well. And it kind of develops on the notion that Aldo Rossi put out in his famous book, talking about the synthesis of object, place, artifact, and event, and merging those things together to create what he called urban shaping. And I think that's a fascinating proposition, you know. It's interesting, isn't it? You know, if you speak to Cambridge University and has done some research on taxi drivers in London, those that drive Uber and those that drive black cabs. And the Uber driver is entirely reliant on a GPS system and knows London only through Google Maps, really. Whereas the black cab driver will remember that that hotel sits next to that church, off of that public space, off of that square. And memory and their kind of neurological pathways are much richer for it. And I like sharing those memories with my family, my children and my wife. And I think we do that collectively. And I think when we do that collectively, they become significantly stronger for it, rather than, you know, I'm fundamentally lazy, I think, and I can follow a sat-nav. But I remember the days before sat-nav, I understood wayfinding and places and how places operate within tight urban environments in a slightly different way. So in Grafton's scheme, which I think is terrific, it doesn't make any pretensions about that grand courtyard space, the Great Hall. It's really quite harsh and quite urban, because how could you ever compete with the green landscape that sits immediately outside it? You know, the tradition of modernism is the erosion of the boundary between inside and out, isn't it? That's the heritage that we've all been brought up with. So I think there are ways in which we can be slightly more sophisticated about those connections with landscape, with green and blue spaces. And there are statutory obligations on it to do it anyway, aren't there? You know, with SUDs and, you know, rain gardens and sustainable urban drainage, which is a requirement, and bloody good ones too.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Neil. Would any of the other speakers like to come in on that particular point? Because during the pandemic, cities were hotly contested. I mean, the city centres often completely emptied out in some of the cities, and neighbourhoods and green spaces were very much sought after by people. So is there a lot more work to be done in creating those kind of green spaces in our cities? Maybe Aldo or Giuliano. Yeah, city center. And I'm also thinking of the areas that you have showed us, the favelas. Are there any plans for those? I know you mentioned the big issues are better housing, better sanitation.
I guess that slum upgrading technologies and methodologies are important, but they are not priorities to the market and the real estate agents, which are very preeminent in the scenery, actually. But I guess, we should take power. The architects should take power, not as the demiurge Le Corbusian like full power from the past, but as we are in the UK, we might think about Rod Hackney, for instance, which lived in the slums and which took part of the everyday life in the slums and learned from it. I guess we all should have these public institutional programs for a social architecture and planning and schedules and activities and work. We do not have it in Brazil, but we have a law which has been approved in 2008. There's 13 years ever since. But we're still struggling to create this social architecture public service here in Brazil. So I guess we should, yes, take power and work in this issue, but we have to face the economic agents, their interests, and as well the conflicts. But that's how society is. But I think we should be a little more democratic, if you know what I mean, without these illusions of the political power. It should be shared. That's how I think.
Yes, and Giuliano, are architects in Brazil, can they be found in government positions and in, local authorities? Are they trying to get into those positions to make changes?
Yes, there is a movement that began in the 60s that is named Reforma Urbana. It's like urban reform. It's one of these structural reforms for Brazilian nation and the state. But we had a dictatorship in the 60s until the 80s So there has been a lot of problems. But there is a network among teachers and practitioners and collective offices and institutions from the third sector and NGOs in general, which are working in innovative models of slum upgrading and this technical assistance for social housing. We're going to start a national initiative this month with a seminar with people from Northeast, North, and Southeast Brazil to discuss these practices and to spread out the agenda. So we're moving on to make it a little bit more practical.
Thank you so much. And Aldo, did you want to come in there as well? And how involved were architects in the Netherlands during the pandemic in adapting public space or designing, spaces around the needs of people?
I think we're in a part of the world where we have the luxury of providing almost every citizen good housing, good social spaces, good governance. So we're very lucky, and but we really, I think we need a government which put the standards even higher, making more healthy buildings, etc. We need public standards for that, which is much more than the minimum that we have now. And sometimes I'm a really big fan of the Brazilian architecture and from the 60s, of course, and the 50s, but also newer architecture. And there are beautiful projects in cities like Sao Paulo where there are public spaces, public centers with libraries, but also swimming pools, etc. Which really make you hopeful that there's also in Brazil a better future. But we have, in the Netherlands, we have little to complain, I must really say.
I know, of course.
We didn't have a tough lockdown. So it could be a lot worse here. So,
and can I ask you, Aldo, because obviously we always admire kind of the housing as well in the Netherlands, where you're a particularly strong leader, social housing, but also private housing. Do you see, as a question in here from the audience, will domestic private spaces change post-COVID, and the layout and the designs of our house? I mean, a lot of people have said, look, the home office is a really important consideration now of people's homes to have that space when people don't go into the office every day anymore, but also access to outdoor space. Do you see changes there happening?
We have a really last month I read that I think the average people in the Netherlands have on average 65 square meters of housing per person. That's twice as much as in, for example, in Belgium. 65 square meters of house per person. That's really huge. And then we have also a lot of outdoor spaces. We're not highly densely populated. So I really think the issue in the Netherlands is uncomparable to London, let alone, say, the favelas of Brazil. I mean.
Thank you very much. We might end our Q&A at this particular point because we have had almost 90 minutes of our webinar. So I would like to sincerely thank today's speakers. Again, Anne Henry, Fiona Hughes, David Healy from Grafton Architects in Ireland, Neil McGowish from Scott Brownrigg in the Cardiff office, Juliano Jimenez from the Federal University of Para in Brazil, and Aldo Vos from Bakema in the Netherlands. Thank you all so much. You've shared so many interesting projects and ideas, and there's a lot for us to take away from your presentations. I would also like to thank the American Institute of Architects, the Australian Institute of Architects, the Architectural Society of China, the Royal Institute of Dutch Architects, the Council of Architecture and Urbanism in Brazil, the Japan Institute of Architects, the Korean Institute of Architects, the New Zealand Institute of Architects, our own Royal Institute of Architects in Ireland, and the Royal Institute of British Architects for their support and contribution. It's been a true pleasure working and collaborating with all these institutes, and without their support, we would not be here today. A special thank you, though, to Emmanuel Meunier from the RIBA, who is the galvanizing force behind these wonderful webinars. And although this excellent webinar series is about to end for this year, I do hope that we will return in 2022 with more of these webinars, because it has certainly brought us much closer together, and we've all been able to learn from each other and become inspired by each other's projects and found new ways of communicating and collaborating. So here's to more of this for 2022. And thank you all so much again, and goodbye for now. And we hope to see you all and for many more interesting topics in 2022.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.